Long ago, in a time that now lives only in faded books and forgotten ruins, people walked beneath low gray skies, over uneven cobblestone paths, through narrow streets where the wind seemed to carry whispers. The medieval world was quiet in its own way, not the silence of peace, necessarily, but the silence of slow days and patient lives. There were no glowing screens, no humming engines, only the soft clatter of hooves, the distant toll of a church bell, and the rustle of heavy cloth as people moved through their daily routines. Life was, in many ways, hard. But even in the midst of hardship, people looked in mirrors often made of polished metal rather than glass and wondered what others saw when they looked back. Beauty was not just about attraction. It was a form of order, of harmony. It meant more than appearance. It meant status. It meant goodness. And it meant something different depending on where you stood in society. The concept of beauty has always been with us. It sits quietly beside our need for shelter and food. It flickers at the edge of thought, often shaped by our beliefs and the quiet urgings of our communities. In the medieval world, beauty was often tied to what was rare. And what was rare in those times was softness, smoothness, delicacy, things that time and labor tend to wear away. Imagine a woman in a manor house, her gown long and flowing, brushing the floor as she walks. She has pale skin, not from lack of health, but from the fact that she doesn't work outside. Her hands are smooth, not calloused. Her hair is brushed and braided with care. This was beauty not because of its essence, but because it quietly told a story. This person is protected. She is of value, she has the luxury of leisure. Meanwhile, the woman in the village, hands stained with berry juice or clay, hair tied back out of the way, face freckled by the sunshine, may be just as beautiful in the eyes of those who love her. But in the official view of medieval society, her beauty was less proper, less noble. It's not that beauty didn't exist everywhere, but the idea of beauty, as it was spoken about, painted, and written into poems, tended to live in castle walls, not in field rows. There were other beliefs woven into many people of the time believed that a beautiful face reflected a beautiful soul. The church, powerful and watchful, sometimes warned against vanity, but also connected physical appearance with spiritual virtue. A smooth face and soft features were not just signs of wealth, but signs of inner peace and godliness. This thinking gave rise to artwork that idealized holy figures: Virgin Mary with her pale, serene expression, saints with soft curls and calm, symmetrical faces. But most people, of course, didn't live in paintings or poems. They lived in small homes with wooden beams and thatched roofs. They fetched water from wells and gathered herbs for cooking or healing. And yet, even in these quiet lives, there was room for the desire to look pleasing. A simple flower tucked into braided hair, a carefully chosen tunic in a brighter shade, a ribbon, a comb, a bit of beeswax to smooth the hair. The desire to be seen, to be lovely, lived everywhere. One must remember, there were no fashion magazines, no selfies, no glossy posters of people no one could ever actually meet. Ideas of beauty were spread through slow means, illuminated manuscripts, church murals, traveling troubadours who sang of fair maidens and noble lords, and, perhaps most enduring of all, stories told around fires. The village storyteller might describe the Queen's grace as he once saw it from a distance, or the local bard might sing of a lady whose eyes were like silver and whose step was like the breeze. Beauty was passed from voice to voice, shaped by imagination as much as reality. It was also shaped by limitations. People did not see the faces of faraway people. A woman born in a French village might live her entire life without seeing more than a few dozen faces beyond her own kin. What was familiar became the standard. Pale skin became beautiful, not just because it was rare, but because it became associated with the people at the top. Just as wealth can decide what music is popular, so too did the wealthy shape what beauty looked like. Men, too, had their own quiet expectations. A strong jaw, a clean complexion, a thoughtful brow, these traits were whispered about in the same songs and painted into the same stories. A knight might be brave and honorable, but he was also supposed to be handsome in a particular way. Not wild or rough, but composed, strong, and graceful in his movements. Even in armor, a certain elegance was admired. But the truth is, for many, beauty was simply a flicker of something pleasant in the eye. A mother might look at her child, dirty from playing in the mud, and smile with a feeling no painting could ever capture. A man might notice the way the sunlight falls on a woman's hair as she carries a basket of apples, and feel a sudden softness in his chest. These moments were unrecorded, but they were real. Over time, some of these quiet standards became louder. They were written into poems and captured in tapestries. The image of the ideal woman, tall, thin, with long golden hair and a gentle smile, became something women were expected to aim for. And for those who did not or could not fit that mold, there was little choice but to go on with life as it was, often with little time to worry about such things. Survival was hard. Beauty, for many, was a distant dream. Still, humans, being what they are, found time, even in hardship, to adorn, to adjust, to admire. The tiniest scrap of lace, the neatest pair of boots, a twist of hair pinned just right. These small acts were, in their own way, resistance against the grayness of daily life, a declaration. I am here. I matter. I am worth looking at. So now, centuries later, as you lay in bed and let your eyes begin to close, think not of the loud kind of beauty, the flashing lights and impossible perfection, but the quiet kind, the kind that lives in slow walks and soft fabrics, in candlelight, in the curve of a forehead once carefully plucked to match a distant queen. And know that long before you, people worried about how they looked, tried to fit in, tried to stand out, and sometimes just wanted to feel lovely. And in the end, maybe that's all any of us ever want. In the quiet mornings of the medieval world, before the birds had fully stretched their wings and before the hearths had been stoked back to life, there were women standing in front of dim mirrors, their faces just barely visible in polished bronze or the shine of still water. There were no electric lights, no brightly lit bathrooms, and no makeup drawers full of powders and creams. And yet, there was still the quiet ritual of trying to look beautiful. There was still the hope, however small, of being seen in a certain way. Beauty was a kind of code. And in this world, few things whispered beauty more clearly than pale skin and a high forehead. To have pale skin was not just a matter of complexion, it was a statement. It told a story. It said that you did not spend your days outside toiling under the sun. You were not bent over a field or standing at a market stall, sunburnt and weathered. Instead, you were protected from the elements, shaded by curtains and stone walls, tended to by others. Pale skin suggested wealth, comfort, and privilege. It became more than just a trait, it became a goal. And so, people tried to keep their skin light, even if nature had given them otherwise. They avoided the sun as much as they could. Some women would wear wide-brimmed hats or long veils to protect their faces during the warmer months. Others applied mixtures of vinegar and lead-based powders to their faces, chasing a porcelain smoothness that today we know came at great cost to their health. But they didn't know that then. They only knew what they saw in others' faces, that glowed pale in candlelight. Skin that looked like ivory in tapestries and painted portraits. Sometimes the desire for pale skin went beyond the face. Hands, arms, and necks were covered to avoid tanning. In noble courts, to show any trace of sun-darkened skin was to mark oneself as common, unrefined. This led to the strange reality where the natural color of the skin became less important than the lengths one would go to keep it pale. And over time, this standard became deeply woven into the collective sense of beauty, so deeply that many carried it with them in secret. Like a longing they never fully spoke aloud. The high forehead was another curious piece of this medieval ideal. It might seem unusual to modern sensibilities, but in many parts of medieval Europe, especially during the later Middle Ages, a tall, smooth forehead was considered a mark of elegance, refinement, and strangely enough, intelligence. The belief was that a larger forehead reflected a mind full of wisdom, a noble heart, or perhaps even a closeness to God. To achieve this look, women would sometimes pluck away their hairlines, removing the soft baby hairs at the top of the forehead, and even pulling further back if needed. It wasn't a small effort. It took time and patience. There were no tweezers as we know them, just sharp instruments and careful hands. Some would go even further and remove their eyebrows altogether, replacing them with thin strokes of pigment or simply leaving the space bare. This wasn't about mimicking anyone famous or following a celebrity. It was about aligning with a quiet expectation, a whisper passed down through generations, embedded in paintings and reflected in the admiration of others. In portraits of noble women, the look is unmistakable: long necks, pale skin, and foreheads that seem to go on forever. There is a stillness in those faces, a calm that suggests a kind of ideal that had nothing to do with emotion and everything to do with appearance. To look serene, untouched, and smooth was to be desirable. In this stillness, beauty lived, in movement or sparkle, but in the absence of labor, the absence of sun, the absence of imperfection. It's worth remembering that mirrors were rare and imperfect. Most people saw themselves only in small glimpses, reflections in water, the occasional glance in polished metal. But they saw others. They saw the noble lady at a distance during a festival, or the visiting duchess as she walked through the village square, her face hidden behind a fan or veil. These brief moments shaped the imagination, and from that imagination, ideals were born. It wasn't just women who were drawn to these ideals. Men, too, admired these traits, not necessarily with romantic desire, but with respect and awe. A woman, with pale skin and a high forehead, belonged to a world they might never touch, a world of refinement, art, and soft music echoing through stone halls. It made her seem distant, ethereal, almost holy. And that was part of the point. Beauty, at that time, wasn't meant to be relatable. It was meant to be above the ordinary. It was aspirational, unreachable. But of course, there were many who did not or could not follow these ideals. Life outside the castles was hard. Women worked in fields, in gardens, in markets. Their skin darkened under the sun. Their foreheads were left as nature made them. And yet, beauty still lived there. to just not in the ways that stories chose, to tell, a quick laugh, a glint in the eye, the wind catching the edge of a shawl, these were their moments, their flickers of charm. Sometimes, a girl might try to lighten her skin using crushed herbs or milk, or she might smooth her forehead with scented oils, dreaming quietly of a court she would never see. But more often, she simply lived, she worked, she spoke, she loved, and in the quiet of her own world, perhaps she never gave much thought to pale skin or high foreheads. Or if she did, it faded quickly under the weight of more pressing concerns, food, warmth, safety. Still, for those in the upper levels of society, these beauty standards held firm. Entire rituals developed around them. There were creams made from animal fat, lead, and vinegar. There were pastes to lighten freckles and lotions to make the skin soft. Plucking was done with care, sometimes with help from maids. These practices were not just about appearance. They were about status, identity, and belonging. And as years passed, these ideals lingered. Even as new styles emerged and old ones faded, the image of the pale, smooth-faced woman with the high, thoughtful forehead endured in stained glass, in tapestries, and in songs. It became part of the collective memory of Budia, soft echo that can still be heard if you listen closely. Now, as you lie still and let your breath settle, imagine one of those women standing by her small window, the light just starting to rise behind the hills. She runs a comb through her hair, feels the smoothness of her brow, and lifts a cloth to protect her skin from the coming sun. She doesn't speak. She simply watches the world wake up, wondering quietly if she be seen today. And somewhere far away, you rest your head and join her in stillness, thinking not of what beauty is, but of how softly it moves through time. Long before shampoo bottles lined bathroom shelves and before hair salons buzzed with conversation, people still cared deeply about the way their hair looked. Hair was not just a part of the body, it was a symbol, a quiet, flowing sign of beauty, health, and even morality. In the medieval world, golden hair held a special place in the imagination. There was something otherworldly about it, something rare. It shimmered in candlelight, it caught the eye in the pages of illuminated manuscripts, and it glowed softly in the stained glass windows of stone cathedrals. To have hair like gold was not just lucky, it was admired, it was praised, and it was, in some cases, pursued. Naturally, blonde hair was uncommon in many parts of medieval Europe, though it was more typical in northern regions. But rarity often leads to desire. And so golden hair became a symbol not just of beauty, but of purity, nobility, and sometimes even divinity. Saints in paintings often had halos, but they also often had hair that gleamed like sunshine. Queens were described in poetry as having locks like spun gold. Fair maidens in ballads were often flaxen-haired, a term that suggested both color and softness. Of course, not everyone was born with hair like this, but that didn't stop people from trying to make theirs look the part. Methods for lightening hair varied, depending on location and what was available. In warmer regions, women would sometimes sit in the sun with special herbal rinses in their hair mixtures made from saffron, lemon juice, chamomile, or even ashes. The sunlight would help lift the color, lightening it just enough to catch a golden hue. It wasn't fast, and it wasn't always safe, but the results when successful were enough to make the effort worth it. There were no dyes as we know them today, only natural substances and time. Sometimes women would even use lye, a harsh substance that could damage hair and skin, but had the power to bleach. Beauty was often a balance between risk and reward. Even when the results were subtle, the idea of looking just a bit more golden, a bit more angelic, kept the practice alive. Hair became not just a part of one's appearance, but a project, a quiet act of devotion to an ideal. Braiding was also important. Hair wasn't left loose very often, especially for adult women. In most medieval societies, especially in Christian Europe, modesty was encouraged, and hair was seen as something that should be kept tidy, contained, or even covered. A woman might wear her hair in long, intricate braids coiled around her head or hidden beneath a veil or wimple. But even in hiding, the hair mattered. The way it was brushed, the scent it carried, the softness of it all, these things were noticed. A braid peeking out from beneath a headdress, shining gold in the sunlight, was like a quiet little miracle. Men noticed, they always did. Songs were written about hair like honey and hair like summer fields. Troubadours, wandering poets, and musicians sang of beautiful women with golden locks. These songs were sometimes exaggerated, of course, but they helped shape the way people thought about beauty. They spread the idea that certain features like light hair meant something more than just good luck. They meant virtue, mystery, desirability. Eye color, too, had its own quiet role in medieval beauty standards. There were no colored contact lenses, of course, no photos or filters, and yet eyes were praised just the same. In poems and paintings, women were said to have eyes like stars, like the sea, like moonlight on water. Blue eyes and gray eyes, in particular, were associated with gentleness, delicacy, and spiritual purity. Dark eyes weren't necessarily unattractive, but they didn't fit the ideal image that many poets loved to describe. In some cultures, blue eyes were rare, and like golden hair, that rarity added to their appeal. They seemed distant, like something from another world. In religious artwork, the Virgin Mary was often painted with blue eyes and golden hair, not because of historical accuracy, but because those features had come to represent innocence, holiness, and light. The people painting these images likely never saw Mary, of course, but they painted her how they imagined goodness should look. It's worth remembering that many of these ideals were shaped by art more than reality. In day-to-day life, most people had brown or dark hair, and dark eyes were far more common. But art had power, and once something is praised in enough songs, and seen in enough paintings, people begin to believe in its value. They begin to chase it, even if they never catch it. There was also something symbolic about light-colored features. They suggested transparency, clarity, and softness. Light passed through them differently. They didn't hide as much. This, too, added to their spiritual associations. A woman with golden hair and pale blue eyes seemed untouched by the world. She seemed more like a dream than a person. In a time when daily life was often hard and dirty and loud, this dream was comforting. But even for those who didn't fit the ideal, there were ways to create beauty. Hair could be washed with rosewater or scented herbs. Eyes could be framed with dark lashes or softened with gentle glances. People learned to make the most of what they had. They paid attention. They noticed. A girl might not have golden hair, but if she smiled a certain way in the firelight, she might be just as unforgettable. In noble courts, hair and eye color became part of how people were described, remembered, and even judged. A young noblewoman might be praised more for her looks than her character, simply because she had the right features. This could be both a gift and a burden. Beauty opened doors, but it also placed people inside narrow cages of expectation. A girl praised only for her golden hair might wonder what would happen if she lost it, or if someone else's hair shone brighter. And so, beauty became something fragile. It had to be maintained, protected, worried over. Hair had to be brushed, just right, kept clean, carefully styled. Eyes had to be kept clear, awake, and soft. And through it all, the idea remained that to be seen as beautiful was to be seen as good, valuable, even holy. Now, centuries later, you can close your eyes and imagine a quiet room in a stone tower. The air cool, the light dim. A girl sits, with her hair spread over her lap, combing it slowly with a wooden brush. She hums to herself, thinking of nothing in particular. Perhaps she's remembering a song she once heard, or wondering if someone might notice her tomorrow. She lifts a strand of hair to the light and wonders if it catches gold. Outside, the wind moves gently through the trees. Somewhere, a bell chimes. And you, listening to this quiet memory of long-ago beauty, can let your thoughts drift like silk on the breeze, soft and slow, until sleep arrives. In the medieval world, long before wardrobes were built to bursting with clothes for every mood and occasion, what someone wore meant far more than comfort or style. Clothing in those centuries didn't just keep a person warm or shield them from rain. It told stories, quiet ones, but powerful. A person's garments whispered to the world what they owned, where they belonged, what they hoped to be, and what they wished others would see in them. Beauty was not only found in the face or the hair, but in fabric and color, in the way clothes hung from the shoulders and brushed the ground, in the way sleeves flowed like ribbons in the breeze. A woman walking through a great hall in a gown of velvet and fine embroidery didn't need to say anything at all. Her garments spoke for her. They told onlookers that she came from wealth, that she was protected and well-fed, that her place in society was above the toil of the common world. And because her clothes told this story, they became a part of her beauty. In fact, for many, clothing was one of the clearest signs of beauty. A lovely face meant something, but a rich gown meant more. The eyes might deceive, but silk did not lie. It wasn't just about luxury, it was about contrast. The vast majority of medieval people owned very few clothes. A peasant might have a single tunic for work, a second one for Sundays, and a cloak. For winter, that was all. And so when someone passed by in garments made from imported fabrics, dyed in deep and vivid colors, sewn with gold or trimmed in fur, they seemed to shine like stars against a dark sky. Their beauty came from how different they looked, how far removed they were from the dusty earth and the worn shoes of the everyday folk. Certain fabrics held special meaning. Wool was common and useful, warm, sturdy, practical, but it was not glamorous. Linen, used for undergarments and head coverings, was softer and finer, but still modest. Silk, however, was a wonder. Imported from faraway lands along treacherous trade routes, silk gleamed softly in the light, its texture smooth and rich. Wearing silk was like wearing a secret. It told everyone around you that you had the means to afford something rare, and in a time when rarity equaled beauty, silk was as lovely as any jewel. Color mattered, too. Not all colors were equal, and not all were available to everyone. Dyes came from plants, minerals, and sometimes insects, and some of them were incredibly difficult to make. Deep red, especially a rich crimson, was one of the most expensive colors to produce. The dye often came from tiny cochineal insects, or from the root of the madder plant, and it took time, skill, and access to rare ingredients. Wearing crimson wasn't just a fashion choice, it was a declaration. It said, I have power, I have status, I have the kind of beauty that others notice. Blue, especially a deep blue, made from lapis lazuli, was another color tied to wealth. Lapis was imported from far-off lands, often from regions as distant as Afghanistan, and ground into a fine powder to be used not only in paint but also in dyes. Because of its cost, deep blue became associated with the Virgin Mary in religious art, pure, holy, and precious. When a woman wore blue, she drew on those meanings, whether she intended to or not. She became more than just herself. She became an image, a reflection of what others were taught to revere. There were also laws in place, sumptuary laws, that controlled who could wear what. These laws weren't about fashion, they were about control. They told people what was appropriate based on their class and station in life. A merchant might have the money to buy fine velvet, but the law could forbid him from wearing it if he didn't have noble blood. A baker's daughter might dream of a gown with fur trim, but if she wore it in public, she might be fined, or worse, punished. These laws reminded everyone of their place. They also made clothing even more powerful, because when something is forbidden, it becomes even more desirable. Within the rules, people still found ways to express themselves. The cut of a sleeve, the width of a belt, the pattern of embroidery, these small details became ways of standing out. Beauty in clothing wasn't always about the boldest color or the rarest fabric. Sometimes it was about elegance, proportion, and craftsmanship. A gown that flowed just right when someone walked. A tunic that fit close to the body but not too tightly. A headdress that framed the face with perfect symmetry. These choices were quiet, but they spoke volumes to those who knew how to listen. Men, too, expressed beauty through clothing. A nobleman might wear a doublet close-fitting and, finely, tailored beneath a long cloak lined with fur. His hose might be dyed in matching colors, his shoes pointed and decorated. A sword at his side, not just for defense, but for appearance. The way he stood, the way his clothes fit him, the way he carried himself, all these things contributed to how attractive he was considered to be. Handsome, in the medieval sense, was not always about the face. It was about presence, about how well you wore your station. Jewelry, belts, buttons, and brooches were also part of the story. A single jewel might be worth more than a peasant's yearly earnings. A delicate necklace of pearls could transform a plain gown into something breathtaking. Beauty was often in the details. The sparkle of a gemstone in firelight. The gentle sway of a pendant as someone turned their head. These ornaments were subtle, but they were noticed, especially in a world with so few distractions. Small details could seem enormous. For those who could not afford luxury, beauty still found its way into clothing. A carefully patched tunic, a hand-woven scarf, a simple dress dyed with berries, and sewn with love. These carried meaning. They spoke of effort, pride, and a desire to look one's best, even with limited means. A girl might braid flowers into her hair to match her only dress. A boy might polish his boots until they gleamed. These were small acts of dignity in a world that didn't always offer many chances to shine. Clothing was not always comfortable. Long gowns dragged on the floor, gathering dirt. Headdresses could be heavy and difficult to manage. Tight bottoms and layered garments grew hot in summer and stiff in winter. But fashion, even then, required sacrifice. To look beautiful, one often had to be slightly uncomfortable. This was accepted, perhaps even expected. As the years passed, styles changed. Sleeves widened, hemlines rose and fell, collars grew taller, but the role of clothing stayed the same. It remained a silent but powerful language. A person walking into a room didn't need to say who they were. Their clothing did it for them. Now, centuries later, we look back and see only fragments of cloth buried in the earth, faded illustrations in books, dusty mannequins in museum halls. But once, those garments moved. They rustled softly in candlelight. They shimmered during dances. They hugged bodies in winter and fluttered in summer wind. They were lived in, loved, admired. And tonight, as you lie still and begin to feel sleep reaching out to wrap around you, you might imagine the soft feel of silk against the skin or the weight of a heavy wool cloak on your shoulders. You might picture a gown the color of twilight or boots that click gently against stone. You might see yourself walking down a long corridor, the hem of your robe just brushing the floor. The flicker of torchlight casting golden shapes around you. No one says a word, but everyone notices, and slowly, quietly, you disappear into that dream. In the medieval world, where walls of stone surrounded cities and horses' hooves echoed down narrow streets, men were watched just as women were judged, admired, and imagined. Though beauty ideals often focus on women, the appearance of men mattered too. Their faces were painted in manuscripts, described in ballads, and carved into cathedral stone. And like everything else in that slow-moving world, beauty for men was tied deeply to their place in society. their duties, and the quiet expectations that followed them through every corridor, courtyard, and battlefield. A handsome man, by medieval standards, was not always the rough warrior of modern fantasy. Yes, strength mattered. Broad shoulders and a confident stride were admired, but strength was often paired with grace. There was elegance in the way a nobleman carried himself, how he stood, how he bowed, how he smiled, with just the right amount of restraint. It was not the smile of a boy, but of a man who knew things, who had read books in Latin, who could ride a horse without shifting in the saddle. Poise was as important as muscle. The face, too, had its standards. A well-proportioned nose, high cheekbones, and clear skin were praised. A strong jaw was admired not just for its shape, but for what it represented: firmness, determination, the ability to speak with authority. Eyes were often described in poetic terms: deep, thoughtful, piercing. Brown eyes might suggest loyalty and steadiness, blue eyes might suggest nobility, mystery, or even divine favor. And eyebrows, though not shaped in the way modern fashion demands, were expected to be full and expressive. A frame for the emotions that flickered across a knight's face in a moment of silence before battle. Hair was another canvas. For noblemen, and those of higher rank, hair was often grown to a medium length, curled or waved at the ends, and scented with oils or perfumed powders. Short-cropped hair was sometimes associated with monks, penance, or humility, but among the fashionable, a fuller style was common. Beards were worn depending on the era, sometimes full and flowing, sometimes trimmed to a neat point. A beard could make a man look wise, powerful, mature, or it could make him look untamed, which could also have its own appeal. Cleanliness mattered, though the standards were not what we know today. Men of rank washed frequently compared to the poor. They had access to basins of warm water, scented soaps made from animal fats and herbs, and even public bathhouses in some towns. A clean man was a respectable man, a man who smelled of rose. Water or mint might turn heads without saying a word. A well-groomed appearance was not simply vanity, it was part of the unspoken language of status and care. A man who looked after his body was thought to be capable of looking after his lands, his household, and his people. Clothing was central to a man's beauty. Much like for women, a man's attire told everyone what kind of life he led. A doublet would be made from fine wool, velvet, or silk, cut to fit close to the body to show off his shape. Colors were carefully chosen. Rich hues, like burgundy, navy, and forest green, were reserved for those with the means to afford the dyes. Gold and silver threads might edge his sleeves or decorate the hem of his tunic. A beautifully crafted belt, a signet ring, a well-made cloak, claspies were the quiet details that marked a man as someone to be noticed. Shoes, too, were part of the equation. Long pointed shoes, called poulaines, were fashionable among the upper classes at certain times. The longer the point, the more fashionable or foolish, depending on who was asked. A man might wear a soft cap or a feathered hat or even a circlet of metal during ceremonies. Every detail mattered. Fashion was not just the realm of women. It was a way for men to express their power, their culture, and their standing still. Beauty for men wasn't only about how they looked, it was also how they moved. A knight was expected to ride with ease, to dance with elegance, to kneel and rise without stumbling. Even in armor, a kind of fluidity was praised. Swordsmanship was not just about battle, it was also performance. A beautiful man was not brutish. He was composed, balanced. He could carry himself across a room like he belonged there, with eyes watching, noting every gesture. Music, poetry, and courtly behavior also added to a man's appeal. To be well-spoken was to be well regarded. Men learned to compose verses, play instruments, and recite the tales of old. The idea of courtly love, the romantic tradition that swept through noble courts, shaped how men behaved. To long for a lady from afar, to serve her with loyalty and dignity, to praise her beauty in gentle terms, this made a man not weak, but refined. Even his longing became part of his charm. Of course, most men did not live in courts or wear velvet tunics. The farmers, the blacksmiths, the herders, they had their own kind of beauty. Calloused hands, sun-darkened skin, broad chests from hard work. These men were not painted in books or sung about in courtly songs, but they were admired in their own circles. A strong worker was respected. A man who could build a house or plow a field was seen as desirable. His beauty was found not in perfume or poetry, but in sweat, endurance, and quiet strength. And still, even among the working classes, men cared about appearance. A tunic might be patched, but kept clean. A beard might be rough, but trimmed with care. A leather belt might be handmade, worn smooth by use, but proudly displayed. Shoes, though plain, would be oiled and sturdy. People found ways to look good within their means. Because looking good wasn't just about vanity, it was about showing self-respect, about having pride in who you were, no matter how little you owned. Religion also played a role in shaping male beauty. The ideal Christian man was expected to be modest, clean, well-ordered, and devoted. Saints were often depicted as glowing with inner light, calm, and composed. Their beauty simple and spiritual. The balance between appearance and humility was delicate. To look too vain was frowned upon, but to be careless with one's appearance was seen as a kind of moral failing. The goal was not showiness, but dignity, quiet, measured dignity. And so, from castle halls to village paths, from cloisters to town squares, men existed under their own silent gaze, measured by others, admired or overlooked, noticed for how they wore their cloaks, or how they spoke. In a crowd, they worried about looking strong, but not harsh, handsome, but not soft, noble, but not proud. These balances, though never written in stone, followed them like shadows. Now, the hush of your own room, with the world finally still. Imagine a man walking through a medieval courtyard, his cloak trailing gently behind him. Perhaps he pauses at a fountain, running a hand through his neatly brushed hair. Perhaps he checks his reflection in the water, not with pride, but with hope that someone, somewhere, will see him not just as he must be, but as he wishes to be, beautiful, in the quiet way of his time. Let that image soften your thoughts. Let the rustle of his sleeves and the gentle thud of his boots across stone ease you into silence. There is nothing to chase, nothing to fix. Just this stillness, this moment, this quiet portrait from long ago, resting gently in your mind. Beauty in the medieval world was not only seen in the mirror or felt in the rustle of silk. It was also believed to live within the soul, the heart, the spirit. These quiet, invisible things were thought to shape a person's outer appearance. What was inside could shine through. A kind heart, a pure spirit, a generous nature. These were not simply virtues. They were thought to leave marks on the body, like soft fingerprints of goodness that others could notice without quite knowing why. In churches and monasteries, in sermons and stories, the idea was often repeated. True beauty comes from virtue. A woman might not have golden hair or clear skin, but if she was modest, gentle, and devout, then she was beautiful in the eyes of God, and, by extension, in the eyes of those who mattered most. A man might not have strong shoulders or perfect posture, but if he was just, loyal, and kind, his beauty would show in his actions, in the way he spoke, in the way he moved through the world. Medieval people believed the body was not separate from the soul. The two were linked. What one felt, the other reflected. Anger could twist a face. Jealousy could darken the eyes. Greed might stoop the shoulders. These were more than metaphors. They were accepted truths. A person's appearance was seen as a kind of window, a quiet glimpse into the state of their soul. And so, spiritual beauty became something to notice, to admire, to aspire to. It was a kind of radiance, not made from light, but from goodness. It couldn't be bought. It couldn't be painted or stitched or braided. It came from the things a person did when no one was watching. The prayers whispered at night, the coins left quietly for the poor, the forgiveness offered when it was not deserved. This view shaped how people thought about physical flaws, too. A scar, a birthmark, a twisted limb. These things were not always seen as marks of ugliness. Sometimes, they were seen as signs of suffering, endurance, even holiness. Saints were often described as having humble appearances. Some were even physically deformed, yet they were beautiful in their humility, in their sacrifice. In hagiography, stories about the lives of saints' beauty came from within. Their bodies might have been weak or wounded, but their spirits were bright. One such story tells of a nun who was plain in face, but sang with such devotion that people believed angels must be listening. Another tells of a monk who had lost one eye in a fire, but whose voice moved others to tears during prayer. Their beauty was not in symmetry or smoothness, but in the deep light of their goodness, their faith, their surrender to something greater. There was also the belief that suffering refined the soul and, by extension, purified the body. Fasting, for instance, was seen as a way to purify oneself both spiritually and physically. Many devout individuals would eat very little, sleep on hard surfaces, or deny themselves warmth, not for punishment but for clarity. They believed the body was a vessel for the soul, and that through suffering it became more beautiful in the eyes of God. A thin, pale face with dark shadows beneath the eyes might not have fit courtly ideals, but to some, it reflected a spiritual journey, a closeness to the divine. Silence was another kind of beauty. To speak gently, to wait your turn, to listen more than you spoke. These were not just signs of manners. They were signs of internal peace, and therefore, signs of beauty. A person who was noisy or boastful, who sought attention or praised themselves, was thought to be unbalanced. Disorder on the inside showed itself on the outside. A graceful person, on the other hand, was one who knew how to be still, how to be quiet, how to be present without needing to be the center. People often watched others not only for how they looked, but for how they behaved. At feasts, for instance, guests were observed not just for their attire, but for how they used their hands, how they held their cup, how they reacted when spoken to. A kind face was not just one that smiled, it was one that listened, that remained patient, that did not frown when bored or insulted. Gracefulness was beauty. Composure was beauty. In some traditions, even humility itself was considered the most attractive trait. To lower your eyes when complimented, to deflect praise, to live simply when you could have chosen splendor. These things were admired. They suggested strength of character, not weakness. It was believed that a person who did not need attention or admiration was more beautiful because they had already found peace. This way of thinking created a kind of quiet standard, one that wasn't worn on the outside, but carried within. Some people chased it through prayer, others through service, others simply through the way they lived. It wasn't about being perfect. It was about striving, trying, staying open to goodness. Even among those who weren't deeply religious, the idea of inner beauty lingered. A kind-hearted neighbor might be remembered longer than a wealthy one. A gentle teacher might be more respected than a loud one. And within families, stories passed down, not just the color of someone's eyes or the shape of their face, but the way they smiled when comforting a child, the way they forgave easily, the way they worked without complaint. Over time, this inner beauty became part of the way people hoped to be remembered, not just for their clothing or hair, but for how they treated others, for the warmth in their voice, for the quiet they carried like a soft lamp inside them. Today, as you lie still and let the world grow dim, you might think of one of those people, someone who walked through their village with no jewels or gold, but whose presence made people feel safe, whose words brought calm, whose hands lifted others gently, whether through work, kindness, or prayer. Their faces have long since faded from memory. Their names may be forgotten, but the shape of their beauty remains soft as a lullaby, lasting as light. And now, as sleep begins to gather, you can imagine yourself in that time, the stone walls, the candle flicker, the hush of early morning in a chapel or garden. You are not seen for your clothes or your hair. You are not measured by your posture or your hands. You are seen for your heart, for the way you carry it quietly, steadily, like a lantern through the dark. And that is beautiful. In the long stretch of medieval life, before mirrors were common and before people saw their own reflections more than once a day, if that beauty was understood through other eyes, you didn't look at yourself to know what you looked like. Other people told you, sometimes gently, sometimes in passing. A compliment murmured during a feast, a mention in a song, a glance held a little too long. These small things were the medieval version of a reflection, and so beauty lived not in self-awareness, but in the way others saw you, remembered you, and spoke of you when you were not in the room. But memory, of course, is a tricky thing. It smooths out some features and sharpens others. It forgets flaws and invents perfections. And because of this, beauty in the medieval world was preserved not through photographs or portraits, but through stories, songs, and the long, curling threads of imagination. A beautiful woman in a tale became more beautiful with each telling. A handsome knight in a poem became taller, braver, more golden each time the verses were read aloud. And in this way, ideals of beauty floated free from the body. They lived in dreams, in language, in the warm flicker of memory rather than in flesh and blood. Storytelling was one of the most powerful ways beauty was passed along. In castles, in cottages, around fires, in fields, people shared tales. A hero who saved a town, a maiden with hair like sunlight, a prince who rode into danger with shining armor and gentle eyes. These were the images that shaped what people thought was beautiful. Even if no one they knew looked like that, the image stuck. It was a kind of shared fantasy, passed along not because it was common, but because it was special. And so, beauty was not always real. It was remembered, imagined, longed for. A woman might look back on her youth and recall the way someone once told her she looked like a queen, and that memory, small and warm, would become the truth in her mind. A man might remember how a girl once told him his eyes were kind, and, for the rest of his life, he would carry that kindness in his expression, almost unknowingly. In a time without photos or recordings, memory created the shape of beauty, and in a way, that made it more tender. Art played a role too, though it was not meant to capture reality. Medieval painters and sculptors often idealized their subjects. Faces were softened, lines were smoothed, proportions were corrected not to deceive, but to express the spirit more than the surface. A saint in a stained glass window might not resemble any real person, but her posture, her expression, the colors that surrounded her, all of these were chosen to evoke a sense of holiness, serenity, and yes, beauty. These images lingered in the minds of those who saw them. A child might grow up remembering the face of a saint, not because it was real, but because it was beautiful in a way that made them feel something. Even books, rare and treasured as they were, helped shape beauty. Illuminated manuscripts, decorated with careful drawings and brilliant colors, often included small portraits, not of real people, but of idealized ones. Figures in these books had delicate hands, flowing garments, and serene expressions. Their gestures were slow, their features calm. They were meant to reflect inner harmony, and so their outward beauty followed. A person who studied these pages might come to believe that real beauty meant stillness, gentleness, and grace, not excitement, not movement, not noise. Music, too, added its voice. Songs about beauty, both joyful and sorrowful, were passed from court to village and back again. A song about a woman's beauty might include details that were impossible. Lips like roses, eyes like stars, a voice like wind through leaves. But that didn't matter. The exaggeration was part of the charm. It allowed listeners to imagine beauty as something just out of reach, something that could only exist in songs. And yet, when someone heard such a song and looked across the room, at someone they admired, even a little, the line between imagined beauty and real life began to blur. Love also played its part in memory. To love someone was, often, to see them as beautiful, no matter how others saw them. And because love stories were told and retold so often, they helped cement the idea that beauty could grow from affection. A knight might fall for a lady not because of her perfect features, but because of a glance, a word, a moment of courage. And once he loved her, she became more beautiful to him than any imagined ideal. That belief made its way into the stories, and from stories into culture. Beauty, then, was not only what you saw, but how you felt. In families, beauty was passed down not just in bone and blood, but in stories. A grandmother might describe how her mother had hair that shone in the sun. A father might tell his children that they had their uncle's strong hands or their aunt's proud jawline. These quiet comparisons helped children see themselves not in isolation, but as part of a lineage. They didn't need mirrors. They had memories. They had words. Even absence had a kind of beauty. A woman who died young might be remembered forever as the loveliest of her family, her features softened by grief, her voice remembered as music. A knight who vanished in battle might be spoken of with shining eyes, his courage and handsomeness woven together in tales that grew with time. The dead, in particular, were polished by memory. Their flaws were forgotten. Their virtues grew taller. Their beauty became something that comforted those left behind. Sometimes, of course, beauty was also distorted. A rival might be described as less attractive than she was. A disliked noble might be mocked for his appearance, even if he was quite striking. Memory could be cruel as easily as it was kind. But more often than not, the memory of beauty leaned toward tenderness, toward warmth. People remembered how others made them feel. And that feeling shaped the image more than any detail of nose or mouth or chin. In that slow-moving world, where most people lived their entire lives within a few miles of where they were born, the beauty that lasted longest was not the kind seen at first glance, but the kind that settled over time. A neighbor whose laugh could be heard from the field. A teacher whose eyes crinkled with kindness. A friend whose hands always reached out to help. These people became beautiful in memory, not because of how they looked, but because of who they were. And in remembering them, others began to smile. Now, centuries later, as you lie quietly and let your thoughts soften, you might think of someone from your own life, a person whose beauty lived not in photographs but in memory. Maybe the way they looked when they listened, or the way they held your hand once, just for a moment. That kind of beauty never fades. It becomes part of the air. Part of your story. And just as the medieval world remembered its beautiful faces, through song, in story, and whispered memory, so too can you hold those faces gently in your heart. Not perfectly, not precisely, but lovingly, quietly. As the world darkens around you and the night presses close, those soft memories will float beside you like candlelight. No mirrors, no paintings. Just the feeling of beauty remembered, warm and close. The medieval world, with all its complexity, moved slowly by modern standards. Days began with the soft light of dawn and ended with the dim flicker of candle or firelight. Beauty, like everything else, moved at that same pace. There were no sudden makeovers, no quick transformations, no glowing screens reflecting perfect faces. What was beautiful had time to grow, to settle into people and places like ivy creeping up the side of an old stone wall. Nothing was rushed, everything unfolded. This slow passage of time shaped how beauty was felt and understood. People aged into their faces. A young girl might be called fair in her youth, with pale cheeks and soft hair, but as she aged, her beauty didn't disappear, it changed. Her hands became more skilled, her posture stronger, her voice steadier. In many cases, older women were respected not only for their wisdom, but also for their grace. Beauty that had been youthful became something more enduring, an air of quiet, authority, of patience, of understanding. The same was true for men. A young squire might be admired for his energy and bright eyes, but an older knight was admired for his composure. His discipline, the way he carried years of experience in the lines of his face. Wrinkles weren't signs of fading beauty, they were evidence of a life lived fully. People didn't erase age, they accepted it. They worked alongside it, and beauty adapted accordingly, becoming something richer and softer, like fruit ripening. With time, nature played a quiet but constant role in shaping the sense of beauty. People spent more of their lives outdoors than most do today. The sky, the fields, the forests, they were part of daily life, not backdrops but active companions. As a result, beauty was often described using natural imagery. Hair like wheat, eyes like the sky at dusk, skin like milk or honey. The natural world provided comparisons, metaphors, and ways to understand what people admired in each other. And because the seasons changed slowly and predictably, beauty followed their rhythm. Pale skin in winter, sun-kissed faces in summer, a bloom of youth in spring. A settling calm in autumn. In many villages, beauty also meant health. Not in the sense of fitness, as understood today, but in terms of vitality. A flushed face, bright eyes and full lips were signs of someone well-fed and strong enough to survive. Thinness was not always praised. It was sometimes seen as a sign of sickness or hardship. A fuller body, especially among women, could indicate comfort, security, and childbearing strength. These traits were valued in a world where life was fragile, where survival was never taken for granted. Beauty wasn't separate from life, it was intertwined with it. Quietly and completely. At festivals, beauty took on a more public form. People wore their best clothes, decorated their hair with flowers or ribbons, and presented themselves with care. But even then, it wasn't about standing out with extravagance. It was about honoring the moment, showing respect for the occasion, and being part of something joyful. A boy might try to impress someone with a carved token or a careful bow. A girl might smile a little longer, stand a little straighter. These small gestures carried weight. They were watched and remembered. They were pieces of beauty shared quietly, between people who rarely spoke of such things aloud. And though beauty was admired, it was rarely obsessed over. There were no magazines, no mirrors in every room, no constant pressure to appear perfect. Most people were more focused on survival, on work, on family. Beauty was something to notice and appreciate, not something to chase endlessly. There was a kind of peace in that, a kind of freedom. People aged without apology. They didn't spend hours trying to erase the passage of time. Instead, they dressed for the weather, combed their hair, maybe straightened their posture, and went on with the day. In noble courts, where beauty did receive more attention, there were still limits. A woman might have jewels and servants and silks, but she also knew that a single scandal could erase all that admiration. A man might be praised for his appearance, but if he lost favor, or land, or influence, that beauty faded from people's minds. Reputation was tied tightly to appearance. Beauty was never entirely separate from power, nor from behavior. A kind gesture could enhance someone's looks. A cruel word could diminish them. People noticed, and they remembered. There was also magic, or at least the belief in it. Charms, potions, and prayers were sometimes used to enhance beauty or protect it. A woman might keep a sprig of rosemary near her mirror, or wash her face in dew gathered at dawn. A man might carry a talisman, or wear a ring said to increase his appeal. These practices weren't necessarily seen as foolish. They were part of the mystery of the world, a quiet acknowledgement that beauty was not entirely in our control. It could be influenced, coaxed, protected, but never fully claimed. Even illness and hardship shaped beauty in ways that were quietly accepted. A woman who had survived childbirth was seen with new eyes. A man who returned from war with a limp or a scar might be admired more, not less. Their beauty came from endurance, from resilience, from the quiet strength that didn't need to be announced. In a world where life was often short and difficult, the most beautiful people were often those who had simply continued, who had kept going, kept caring, kept showing up. As the stars blinked over quiet fields and the air cooled in the deep hours of night, beauty took on a different shape, a shape that didn't require witnesses. It was in the hush of breath before sleep, in the warmth of a body resting beside another, in the way someone reached out in the dark, just to touch a hand. These were the moments when appearance no longer mattered, when beauty, soft and unspoken, was simply felt. Now, centuries later, as the world has grown louder, faster, and more crowded with images, there is something restful in returning to that slower understanding. A kind of reminder that beauty doesn't need to be sharp or perfect or constant. It can be slow, it can change, it can live in memory, in kindness, in small gestures that never make it into paintings or poems. And now, as your own thoughts begin to drift, as your breath slows and the night presses gently around you, imagine a world lit by candlelight, where people notice the color of the sky, the sound of footsteps, the way someone's hair catches the last bit of sun. Imagine walking through that world not hurried, not judged, just noticed, in quiet ways, for the beauty you carry without trying. Because, in the end, that was the quiet truth of medieval beauty. It was never entirely in the skin or the bone. It was in how you treated others, in how you endured the day, in how you let the world soften you instead of harden you, and in how, without even knowing it, you became part of the quiet landscape and a lovely piece in the long, slow story of being alive. So sleep now, gently with the slow rhythm of those old lives around you. Let the torches fade, let the voices hush, let beauty rest with you, not as something to reach for, but as something already there. You are already part of that long, gentle history, already beautiful, in your own quiet way.